On April 8, 2018, Easter Sunday, the Kessler family gathered for what was supposed to be a quiet, wholesome tradition. Lily Kessler, just 5 years old, had woken up that morning in pink pajamas with little ducks on the sleeves. Her mother said she was more excited about hiding eggs than finding them. Her grandmother's backyard was modest but well kept, a fenced half-acre with patchy grass, a few tall pines near the edges, and a rose trellis her grandfather had built before he passed. They started the hunt around noon. Lily was one of 5 children participating, all under 10. The adults stood near the porch with lemonade and phones, taking photos and cheering the kids on. It was the kind of memory people expect to revisit fondly. Until everything shifted in a span of minutes, no one can reconstruct exactly. At 12:17 p.m., a neighbor walking their dog saw Lily skip toward the far end of the garden, holding a plastic basket nearly full. Her cousin, age 7, said Lily had spotted a purple egg near the rose trellis. That was the last time anyone could say with certainty where she was. When her name was called for lunch a few minutes later, she didn't answer. It wasn't immediate panic. Her mother thought maybe she'd gone back inside for something. Her older cousin joked she was hiding to win. But by 12:30, the tone changed. Adults began calling her name louder, more urgently. The backyard was searched first, then the front yard, then the entire house. By 12:45, her grandmother was on the phone with 911. It was already too late. The garden was fully enclosed with a 6-foot wooden fence. Every gate was still latched from the inside. No footprints led beyond the grass line. Lily's basket, filled with 8 plastic eggs, was sitting upright in the lawn, less than 10 feet from the rose trellis. The purple egg she'd supposedly seen was never recovered. No overturned mulch, no torn fabric, no sound. It was as if a switch had been flipped and she had vanished mid-step. Verona PD arrived at 12:52 and treated it as a missing child case with potential abduction. The porch door was secured. Family members were interviewed on site. By 2 p.m., 2 search dogs were on the property. Neither could pick up a definitive trail. By dusk, the house and backyard had been combed multiple times. Neighbors volunteered flashlights and boots, walking through nearby woods. Drones with infrared were brought in by state search and rescue. Nothing. Lily's parents were separated but amicable. Both were present that day. No custody disputes, no criminal history in the immediate family. The only non-family adult present was a neighbor who had brought deviled eggs for the buffet table. He stayed for 30 minutes, left before the disappearance, and had an airtight alibi verified by multiple phone pings and a security camera from a gas station across town. Still, he was questioned. Everyone was, everyone except Lily, who remained missing with no sign of struggle, no ransom note, no surveillance footage, and no credible sightings. What made it worse was the stillness of it. The fact that her basket was left there, perfectly upright, as if placed intentionally. No dirt smudges, no signs she had tripped or been grabbed. The grass underneath was undisturbed. Investigators initially floated theories of a snatch and run, a person climbing the fence, grabbing her and jumping out again. But the mechanics didn't make sense. The fence boards weren't broken or bowed, no ladder marks, no tire tracks nearby. There were no known sex offenders in the immediate radius, and no vehicles caught on traffic cameras within a 3-mile perimeter during the 15-minute window in which she disappeared. The search continued through the night. Spotlights lit up the neighborhood. Helicopters circled well into the morning. They drained the nearby storm drains, searched empty sheds, dug beneath wood piles. Nothing. Lily's face was on every telephone pole by Monday. National news picked up the story by Tuesday. Candlelight vigils were held in the town square. Strangers mailed teddy bears and prayers. But within 10 days, the leads dried up. A composite sketch of a suspicious vehicle was later ruled unrelated. Tips slowed to a trickle. The garden was scanned with ground-penetrating radar twice. The only anomaly was a minor soil shift near a flower bed, attributed to irrigation. That corner of the yard became a symbolic place where the family left plastic eggs every spring, but none were ever missing again. Detectives never closed the case, but the investigation entered a dormant phase by the end of that summer. Theories circulated online. Some claimed Lily had wandered off and drowned, though no bodies were ever found in the creek or nearby reservoir. Others believed in a deliberate abduction, citing the silent surgical nature of the disappearance. The family tried to move forward, but never could. They left the house exactly as it was. The rose trellis remained untouched. Every April, on the same day, they gathered again, some still hoping, some silently certain. It wasn't until 7 years later, during a minor landscaping project, that the soil gave something back. By the afternoon of April 8, 2018, the backyard had been swept 5 separate times. Law enforcement, family, and neighbors moved like clock hands, circling, retracing, calling her name. What struck responders most wasn't just the lack of evidence. It was how clean the scene was. No sign of panic, no signs of violence, just an empty patch of grass and a child-sized basket resting quietly in the sun. The longer she remained missing, the stranger the silence became. For a child that small, something should have been left behind. A shoe, a scream, a scuff on the fence. But there was nothing. By 3 p.m., the case had escalated. Idaho State Police and K-9 units arrived. The 2-mile radius around the home was divided into grids. Every street was canvassed. Every empty shed and basement was opened. Helicopters scanned tree lines and creek beds. Volunteers worked until their feet blistered. But Lily Kessler had disappeared without leaving a single trail. For investigators, that was the first red flag. The grandmother's property was reviewed in full. It had 1 entrance and 1 rear gate, both still secured from the inside. No locks had been broken. The grass around the perimeter was undisturbed. A detective stood on the back porch that evening and said aloud what others had been thinking quietly. Lily didn't walk away. She was taken. But then the bigger question came. How? No one had seen a vehicle idle nearby. There were no tire marks on the gravel road behind the fence. The nearest ring camera on the neighbor's shed didn't pick up anything. A broader search for footage across the block yielded nothing more than slow traffic and normal foot patterns. Even dogs trained to trace the scent of missing children hit a dead end just a few feet beyond the trellis. Wherever Lily went, her trail ended in that yard. Investigators expanded their questioning. The Kesslers were cooperative, if shattered. Her mother collapsed twice during interviews. Her father grew increasingly agitated. Both were separated, living in different towns, and had nothing to hide. That much was clear. But there was another name that started surfacing after nightfall. David Kessler, the father's older brother. A man who hadn't been invited, hadn't RSVP'd, but had apparently shown up for the Easter event and left quietly just after noon. At first, the family brushed it off. He had always been a drifter, someone who floated in and out of town during holidays, showing up with half a story and tired eyes. But this time, his presence felt different. He hadn't spoken to Lily in years, and he hadn't told anyone he was coming. Detectives pressed further. David had arrived that morning unannounced, carrying a plastic bag of store-bought cookies and a half-hearted smile. According to Lily's aunt, he mostly kept to himself, lingering near the edge of the yard and smoking. He left shortly after the egg hunt began, saying something vague about work. But no one saw which direction he went, and his vehicle was never identified. When officers tried to reach him that night, his phone was off. 2 days passed before he returned the call and agreed to meet in Boise. He denied any involvement and seemed more annoyed than concerned. He claimed he had left before noon and went back to a friend's trailer outside of town. That friend, however, refused to vouch for him, stating they hadn't seen him in over a week. When pressed, David changed his story twice. Still, without physical evidence, police couldn't make an arrest. He wasn't officially labeled a suspect, but within the family, suspicions began to harden. In town, tension simmered. Some neighbors began locking their gates. Others turned on the Kesslers, accusing them of holding back information. There were quiet rumors about past arguments, about family secrets that had never been settled. One neighbor recalled hearing shouting in the backyard earlier that morning, but when asked for details, couldn't say who had raised their voice. The story shifted with each retelling. Social media only worsened the speculation. People dissected family photos, questioned body language, analyzed timestamps. But the investigation remained grounded in facts, and the facts refused to move. Authorities checked known sex offenders within a 50-mile radius. No one was missing from their registered homes. Interviews continued for weeks. The search widened, then quieted. Tips trickled in from other states, sightings that were always 2 days too late. Each one raised hope, then crushed it again. By early summer, detectives began reviewing psychological profiles. Could Lily have hidden? Could she have wandered into a crawl space or a storage bin? But the house had been torn apart and scanned. Thermal imaging showed no voids. Cadaver dogs hadn't triggered inside or outside the home. It was like chasing air. The worst fear was that she had been taken by someone they all missed. A passing stranger, a delivery driver, someone watching from a distance, waiting for the moment everyone looked away. The idea seemed far-fetched, but it was the only theory that explained the total lack of evidence. Still, every time they returned to the property, the question grew louder. How could a child vanish from a fenced backyard full of family? How could a girl that small disappear in broad daylight without a sound? The question would hang over Verona for years, and beneath it, just out of reach, was a truth no one was yet ready to uncover. It was nearly 6 days after Lily disappeared when a volunteer brought the photo forward. He'd been combing through pictures on his phone, looking for anything useful. Landscape shots, timestamps, background details. Most of it was cluttered. Kids running through the grass, a blur of color. Adults chatting near the patio. But one image taken at 12:05 p.m., just minutes before Lily vanished, stood out. Near the top edge of the frame, behind the trellis, and just beneath the shadow line of the fence, a man was standing alone. He wasn't facing the camera. He seemed to be half-turned, 1 foot angled toward the flower bed, his arm reaching for something in his jacket. The man didn't match anyone known to the family. He wasn't part of the Easter gathering, at least not officially, and no one could say for sure when he'd arrived or where he'd gone. The photo was grainy, zoomed in from a wide shot meant to capture the backyard. But the timestamp, 12:05 p.m., put him at the far end of the garden exactly 15 minutes before Lily was last seen. Detectives enhanced the image as much as they could. Facial features were unclear, but his frame was slim, average height, short, hair, light clothing, no hat. A sketch artist produced a composite based on the blurred contours and general body posture. It was enough to circulate to local agencies in nearby towns, but the response was almost non-existent. No neighbor recalled seeing a man of that description near the home that day. No traffic footage or doorbell camera caught a matching figure on foot or in a vehicle. Even the Kesslers, who'd tried to remember every detail from that day, drew blanks. Lily's mother swore she never saw anyone near the back fence. Her father, still exhausted from daily interviews and media pressure, admitted he couldn't recall anything past noon. But someone had been there, someone who wasn't accounted for, and someone who had vanished just as cleanly as Lily. The photo brought a temporary surge of hope to investigators. It was the first new thread they could tug on. Flyers were updated, a press conference was held, police encouraged anyone who'd attended the Easter event, even those who'd only stopped by briefly, to come forward with footage or photos. A few more trickled in, but none captured the man again. He appeared in only one frame, in one phone, on one angle. Then, he was gone. The case shifted back to its earlier focus, the people who had been at the home that day. And again, one name resurfaced, David Kessler, the uncle. He had already drawn attention for showing up uninvited and leaving without saying goodbye. Now, the fact that no one had seen him between noon and the time Lily vanished created a gap too wide to ignore. The photo of the man near the fence didn't match David's build precisely, but the image wasn't clear enough to rule him out either. Quietly, detectives started asking more pointed questions about his past. What they found wasn't enough to press charges, but it was enough to raise internal alarms. In 2014, at a family reunion in Yakima, Washington, David had been asked to leave early after a distant cousin, then 12 years old, told her mother he'd made her uncomfortable. No touching, no direct threats, just words that felt off. The family never pressed the issue, wanting to avoid conflict. There was no formal complaint, no report. But the memory lingered, and it reappeared now like a wound that never fully closed. The Kesslers, already shattered, were divided. Lily's father stood by his brother, insisting the stories were exaggerated and that David had been scapegoated for being the family outcast. Lily's mother, however, demanded he be questioned again. Tension grew behind closed doors. David, for his part, denied everything. He claimed he had left early because he felt like an outsider and didn't want to disrupt the family vibe. He acknowledged the past accusation, but called it a misinterpretation. He told detectives he had nothing to hide. Still, when asked where he had gone after leaving the Easter event, his answers grew thinner. First, it was a friend's trailer. Then, a walk in the woods. Then he claimed he drove aimlessly for hours. No receipts, no camera evidence, no digital footprint to back it up. The FBI was brought in to profile the case. While David didn't match the stranger in the photograph with certainty, behavioral inconsistencies kept him in the circle of interest. His phones were clean. No disturbing search history, no deleted photos, no burner numbers. But in cases like this, absence wasn't proof of innocence. And without forensic evidence or a confession, suspicion couldn't become action. The family fractured beneath the weight of it. Lily's grandmother stopped speaking to David. One cousin blocked him entirely. But there were still those who defended him, who insisted the photo could have been anyone, that the town had latched onto a ghost, because it was easier than facing the truth, that a stranger could take a child in broad daylight and leave no trail. The sketch was filed. The lead went cold. But every time Lily's name was mentioned in local papers, the photo resurfaced. The man by the fence, standing just outside the warmth of the celebration, was burned into the community's memory. For Lily's mother, it became something worse than a clue. It became a question she asked herself every night. Had she seen him and not noticed? Had he watched them all from the shadows, waiting for someone to look away? There were no answers, only that single image, and beneath it, a clock ticking forward toward a secret buried where no one had thought to dig. With the photo of the unknown man going nowhere and suspicion around the family turning cold, investigators circled back to the one place that never stopped nagging at them: the yard. It had been combed dozens of times, but one detail lingered. During the initial search, one of the cadaver dogs had stopped at the northeast corner of the garden, just past the row of tulips near the base of the trellis. The alert hadn't been aggressive, but it was enough to prompt further checks. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in 3 days after the disappearance. It scanned the yard in wide sweeps. The results came back clean. No cavities, no buried remains, no unusual soil compression. But the dog's reaction was hard to ignore. Officers marked the area and collected soil samples. Testing came back inconclusive. Slight organic disturbances were noted, but nothing outside the range of normal garden activity. Still, it stuck with one of the lead detectives, how the dog paused, sniffed, circled, then moved on, uncertain but unsettled. By early June, the search had officially expanded beyond the property. Authorities moved their focus to remote areas along the creek and outlying farmland. The house faded into the background, but a few online communities didn't let it go. A podcast episode covering Lily's case aired that summer and exploded in popularity. The host, a former crime reporter, dissected every public detail, including the cadaver, dog's behavior, and the radar scan. He brought in experts, retired K-9 handlers, soil analysts, forensic geophysicists. One of them noted something important. Ground-penetrating radar isn't foolproof. Its effectiveness drops significantly in root-heavy soil. In the area near the tulips, dense roots from the trellis. If something had been buried shallow and the ground later settled, it could have masked the signal. That single observation triggered a wave of renewed attention. By fall, a listener from Portland anonymously donated funds to hire a licensed private investigator with excavation experience. The Kessler family was hesitant at first. They had already gone through months of grief, scrutiny, and dead ends, but eventually agreed to let the dig proceed. The new team came in quieter, smaller, and with different tools. In October 2018, they focused exclusively on that one section of the yard. Within hours, they noticed something odd. About 3 feet down, the soil texture changed abruptly. Clay met loam in a way that didn't match the rest of the property. It wasn't a burial site, but it might have once been open space. The lead digger tapped a thin metal probe into the dirt and felt it drop slightly, not into loose soil, but into air. That's when they found it. A hollow pocket roughly the size of a small crawl space, partially collapsed and filled with sediment. A sinkhole, likely natural, but accelerated by weather or age. The top layer had sealed over time, creating the illusion of undisturbed earth. It was just feet from where Lily's basket had been found. The team prepared to open the cavity more carefully, but heavy rains that week had compromised the structure. On the second day of digging, part of the wall gave way. Mud surged into the opening. Tools were lost. One worker's leg was briefly trapped before being pulled out safely. The excavation had to stop. Engineers brought in to assess the sinkhole called it unstable and potentially dangerous. The cavity extended beneath the concrete path near the trellis. If disturbed further, it could threaten the structural integrity of the rear fence and possibly the shed beyond it. The city denied further permits. The dig was paused indefinitely. The private investigator filed a report with law enforcement, but nothing conclusive could be drawn. No bones, no clothing, no trace of Lily. Just a void in the ground and too many unanswered questions. The Kessler family, crushed by the false start, withdrew from further media coverage. Lily's mother stopped responding to interview requests. Her father became more vocal, angry, frustrated with the bureaucracy that halted the only tangible lead in over 6 months. He spoke publicly once, accusing the city of prioritizing property over people. The podcast that had reignited the investigation aired a final update. In it, the host admitted they'd hoped for a discovery, closure, something. But all they had was a sinkhole and a story that didn't want to let go. The house remained untouched. The trellis, the tulips, the walkway, all still there, still hiding whatever secrets they might hold. No one could say for certain whether Lily had ever been beneath that earth or if the ground had simply mirrored the hollow ache left behind. But for the few who still followed the case closely, that patch of dirt became a symbol, not of failure, but of something unresolved. A cavity not just in the ground, but in the story. Something had shifted down there, and someday, if the soil moved again, they believed it might speak. The first letter arrived exactly 1 year after Lily vanished. It was Easter Sunday, 2019. The Kesslers had gathered again, more out of obligation than tradition. No eggs were hidden that year. The backyard was quiet. Her basket, stored in a sealed box since the day she disappeared, remained untouched. Around noon, her father went to check the mailbox, mostly out of habit. Inside was a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from Verona. The note inside was typed in all caps. "You planted too deep." No signature, no explanation, just those 4 words printed on standard printer paper, folded once. He stared at it for several minutes before walking it inside. At first, they thought it was a cruel prank, someone from town trying to get a reaction. The letter was turned over to the local police, logged as evidence, but there were no fingerprints, no saliva on the adhesive, no unusual ink. Nothing traceable. Investigators dismissed it as a hoax, possibly inspired by media coverage of the case. But the timing felt intentional. 1 year to the day. The following year, it happened again. Easter morning, 2020. Another envelope, same postmark, same format. This one read, "She never left the fence." Again, it was turned over to police, and again, no forensics. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Whoever was sending these knew the exact date, and more than that, They knew how to say just enough without saying anything at all. By the third letter, look where the roots split, the Kesslers stopped assuming it was random. It wasn't just language anymore. It was language tied to the backyard, the tulips, the trellis, the very place where dogs had alerted and where a sinkhole had been discovered years earlier. Detectives still wouldn't call it a credible lead, citing the absence of physical evidence, but privately, the case file was reopened for review. The FBI's behavioral unit was contacted. They noted the consistency of tone, structure, and timing, all hallmarks of a planned psychological escalation. Each Easter, the letter came. Spring won't hide her forever. No one looked up. The trellis holds her story. None were mailed more than 15 miles outside town. Each was short, typed, and eerily precise. They were never sent to the family directly, always delivered through the standard route, always, appearing with the rest of the morning's mail, as if the sender wanted them discovered naturally. The media never learned about the letters. It was an unspoken agreement between the Kesslers and law enforcement, a way to protect the integrity of the case. But inside the home, they became a kind of ritual. Lily's father kept them in a locked drawer. Her mother refused to look at them after the third one. Her grandmother, once the warm center of the household, began spending her afternoons staring out the kitchen window toward the garden, not saying a word. The sixth letter arrived in 2023. 6 winters, but she's still warm. That one hit differently. For the first time, the wording felt personal, intimate. It implied knowledge that went beyond metaphor. Investigators began cross-checking anyone with past access to the property, contractors, landscapers, even former neighbors. But the list was long, and the evidence was still thin. By now, the letters had become their own mystery inside the case. Some officers believed they were connected to the disappearance. Others still saw them as a local tormentor looking for control. Both agreed on one thing. The author wanted the family to keep looking down. Then came 2025, the 7th Easter. By then, the case had faded from public view. A few online forums still speculated, but media had stopped covering it annually. The Kesslers barely spoke to each other. Time had worn them down. But when the letter arrived that year, everything changed. Same envelope, same Verona postmark. But this one didn't contain a cryptic sentence. It contained a single typed line. I like when you say blueberries with a B instead of a P. The sentence meant nothing to police, but when the letter was opened in front of Lily's mother, she collapsed. Back in preschool, Lily had struggled with certain letters. Instead of saying blueberries, she said plueberries. It had become a small family joke, one no one outside the home would have known. But more specifically, it was something Lily had written down during a daycare assignment in 2017. Each child had been asked to list their favorite food and draw a picture. Lily had written the word incorrectly, just as she said it. The assignment had never been shared publicly. The paper had been boxed up and stored in a closet, never scanned, never posted online. The only people who'd ever seen it were family and Lily. The letter turned the case upside down. It wasn't just someone taunting them anymore. It was someone who had been with Lily after she disappeared, someone who had heard her speak, someone who had kept something of hers, maybe the drawing itself. The sentence, benign on the surface, was a time-stamped fingerprint, a memory only she could have produced, a voice echoing from somewhere close. And it meant one other thing, that whoever had her had kept her alive long enough to hear her say it out loud. The garden wasn't just symbolic anymore. It was becoming something else, a location, a message board, a map, and somewhere beneath it, something still waited. By the spring of 2025, the case had grown quiet again. The letters had rattled the family, shaken the town, and stirred national curiosity. But without a body, there was no closure, only static. But something shifted that March when a forensic anthropologist working with a private cold case foundation contacted Verona PD. She specialized in historical scent recovery, a relatively new discipline in forensic cadaver dog training. These dogs weren't just trained to detect recent death, They were conditioned to alert to faint traces left years ago, buried deep or masked by time and weather. With the Kessler family's permission, 2 of these dogs were brought to the property. The garden had not been touched since the failed excavation in 2018. The grass had regrown, the tulips replanted, the trellis now worn and leaning. But as soon as the dogs entered the yard, both stopped at the northeast corner. Same place, same arc, near the roots. This time, law enforcement listened differently. With the new letter referencing Lily's speech, something no one outside the family would know, there was renewed weight behind every anomaly. The team didn't bring radar. They brought a soil chemist. Small, sterile cores were taken from the upper and mid layers of the garden bed, just above where the sinkhole had once threatened collapse. The results came back 3 days later. Elevated levels of cadaverine and putrescine, decomposition gases, not strong enough to indicate a fresh burial, but consistent with a body once present, long enough to begin biological breakdown. It was the first physical evidence that someone, had been buried on that property. The yard was declared an active forensic scene. Yellow tape was strung from fence to porch. A tent was erected over the excavation site to shield it from weather and observation. News crews gathered outside the block. The community, once numbed by years of dead ends, now held its breath. For 7 years they had watched from a distance, unsure what to believe. Now, something undeniable was coming up from the earth. On April 2nd, a forensic excavation team began digging by hand. Soil was removed in layers, every shift sifted, every root preserved. And on the second day, buried 6 inches deeper than the original dig had reached, they found it. A small plastic Easter egg, purple, sun-faded, and sealed with mud. It was caked in hardened clay, but intact. It was marked as evidence, photographed, and opened under controlled conditions. Inside was a single white button with a faint blue thread still looped through the eye. It matched the dress Lily Kessler had been wearing the day she disappeared, the same white cotton dress with blue daisies her grandmother had ironed that morning. The same dress Lily's mother had described to reporters through tears. One button, missing from the lower back, likely lost during play. The egg wasn't just a relic, it was a message. Someone had placed it, someone had sealed it, and someone had known it was buried where no one would find it for years. The find triggered a full-scale excavation. Forensic archaeologists began expanding the site in concentric circles. Soil was cataloged, roots cut and preserved. Just beneath the area where the button had been found, a faint outline in the earth began to emerge. A shallow depression, roughly 3 feet long, lined with stone fragments and soft earth. It wasn't deep, it wasn't reinforced, but it was deliberate. And as the soil was removed with surgical precision, the first pieces of human remains surfaced, small, fragile, and unmistakably juvenile. The remains were later confirmed through dental records and mitochondrial DNA to be Lily Kessler. She had been buried no more than 2.5 feet beneath the soil, in a location that had already been searched twice. But the depth, the shifting earth, the root systems, and the earlier cave-in had masked her presence. The sinkhole that had once blocked the original excavation had settled and partially collapsed inward, drawing soil and debris over her shallow grave. Her body had likely been disturbed by that movement, further obscuring any scent or radar profile. The plastic egg, however, had survived intact, like a capsule waiting to be found. Investigators were stunned, not just by the discovery, but by the timing, 7 years to the week, and just days after a letter referencing Lily's preschool language quirk. It reframed everything. The garden had never been symbolic. It had been literal, and the warnings, cloaked in cryptic sentences for years, had been guiding them back to the same spot over and over. Someone had been watching the investigation unfold. Someone had buried her, and someone had wanted her found, eventually. Lily's body was removed with care and transported for full forensic analysis. Her family was notified that evening. There was no press conference, no crowd, just quiet. Her mother stood in the same spot where she'd called Lily's name 7 years earlier, staring at the upturned earth, knowing now that she had never been more than a few feet away. It was not the kind of closure anyone wanted, but it was real. And it came not from a breakthrough in technology or a confession, but from a single button sealed inside a child's toy, left in the soil like a whisper. 2 days after the button was recovered from the buried plastic egg, the excavation site expanded beneath the concrete footpath near the trellis, the exact location where Lily had last been seen. Forensic engineers began mapping anomalies in soil density. They weren't looking for graves anymore. They were looking for voids, an echo in the ground, something that shouldn't be there. Late on the third day, the metal probe struck something hard beneath the walkway. Wood, dry, but intact. What they found next rewrote the entire framework of the investigation. Beneath a mat of stubborn roots and a thin concrete slab was a sealed wooden hatch, half rotted and buried under decades of soil and mulch. A forgotten entryway no one had ever marked on blueprints. It wasn't listed in the property records. It wasn't visible to the eye, but it had been there the whole time. The hatch was pried open slowly. Air hissed out, stale, dry, unmoving. A ladder descended into darkness, short and incomplete, ending just 4 feet down into a shallow cavity lined with crumbling stone. It wasn't spacious, barely enough to sit upright, not a storm shelter, not a bunker. More likely a root cellar, built sometime in the early 20th century and later filled in or forgotten as the garden expanded. Inside, beneath a collapsed corner of brick and tangled vine roots, lay a small human skeleton. The body was curled slightly, as if asleep, arms drawn inward, one leg bent beneath the other. She wasn't hidden, she wasn't buried. She'd been left inside, just beneath the feet of her family, for 7 years. The remains were carefully extracted and transported under full forensic protocol. The dental records confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. It was Lily Kessler. 7 years gone. 7 years of theories, accusations, and search parties. And she had never left the yard. Forensic pathologists examined every inch of the skeletal frame. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no fractures, no knife marks, no evidence of restraint. Her bones were clean, undamaged, and consistent with a child who had died not by violence, but by deprivation. The preliminary cause of death was listed as asphyxia, likely due to lack of oxygen. Dust, sealed air, maybe carbon dioxide buildup from decaying plant material. It didn't happen quickly. Her positioning mattered. She wasn't sprawled out. She hadn't collapsed instantly. The way her body curled suggested awareness, consciousness, possibly for hours, possibly longer. There was no bedding, no toys, no signs of preparation, just the body and fragments of her cotton dress, partially preserved in a corner of the cellar where the ground stayed dry. Her shoes were still on. Detectives returned to the property layout. The cellar had been directly beneath the rose trellis, mere feet from where her basket had been found. No one remembered the hatch ever being open, not the grandmother, not the parents, not the neighbors. A retired construction worker who had helped renovate the home in the 1980s recalled sealing an old crawl space after structural rot was found near the garden. He couldn't say for sure it was the same one. He just remembered pouring concrete and laying stones. No permits were filed. Nothing was documented. The working theory took shape quickly, and it was devastating in its simplicity. Lily had been playing near the trellis. She'd been curious. Maybe had seen the outline of the hatch beneath the vines. Maybe an animal had come out. Maybe she lifted it on her own. The wooden slats weren't heavy. The drop wasn't far. But once she was in, the hatch fell closed. Or maybe it was already cracked and simply gave way beneath her. Either way, she hadn't screamed. Or if she had, no one heard it over the voices and laughter in the yard above. She was in that cellar while the family looked everywhere else. The letters took on new weight. She never left the fence. Spring won't hide her forever. They weren't just cruel games. They were statements of fact. The sender knew she was beneath the garden. They knew details the public didn't. And they waited 7 years before pushing the investigation toward the right square of soil. When the FBI reanalyzed the phrasing, timing, and linguistic patterns, one possibility emerged. Whoever had sent those letters had not killed Lily. They may not have even been involved in her death, But they had known where she was from the very beginning. What haunted the family most wasn't the cellar itself. It was the proximity. The idea that for 7 years, Lily had been beneath their feet during every vigil, every press conference, every sleepless night. That the cadaver dogs had paused near that spot multiple times, that the ground had spoken, faintly, but they hadn't listened close enough. She had not been taken. She had not wandered far. She had fallen into a dark place, and no one had known to look under the stone that everyone had walked past. The garden was no longer just a memory. It was a grave. And as the forensic tent came down and the excavation closed, a new question began to take shape. Not about what happened to Lily, but about who watched it all unfold from the outside, and why they waited so long to lead them back. When the root cellar was finally documented, measured, and photographed, the dimensions painted a cruel picture. Just over 4 feet deep, 5.5 feet long, and barely 3 feet across. Not large enough to store anything of value, not deep enough to hide in without being found, unless someone had long ago forgotten it existed. After forensic teams finished their work, structural engineers were brought in to assess how something like this had gone unnoticed for so long. The wooden hatch was layered with soil and overgrowth, but beneath that was a thin concrete patch poured unevenly and not reinforced. It had cracked sometime in the early 2000s, likely from frost. Over it, the family had placed planters. Above that, the trellis. By 2018, no one in the Kessler household had any reason to believe there was anything underneath their feet besides soil and roots. But now the silence was louder than ever. How had no one remembered? How had no one said anything? The Kesslers told police they'd purchased the property in 1993. At the time, the garden was sparse and overgrown. Records showed that in 1976 the county had marked a SU, permit to decommission an old storm shelter or food cellar on the property, something common in homes built before modern refrigeration. But there was no final demolition report. The cellar had simply vanished from city records. The contractor hired at the time had died 5 years before Lily's disappearance. His notes, if he kept any, were never recovered. What was clear now was that the structure had never been filled in, only concealed. Whether by accident or design, the hatch remained, buried and forgotten for nearly half a century. Lily's parents struggled to process what that meant. For 7 years, they had blamed themselves for not watching closely, for not asking the right questions, for letting her play alone for even 1 second. Now they were faced with a truth that felt worse than failure. It was omission, institutional forgetfulness, a decades-old oversight passed from one homeowner to the next until a child found it and no one found her. Detectives traced the backyard renovations across multiple owners. Not one had reported a hollow space. Some remembered leveling the soil, adding new concrete, repurposing old pathways. But the cellar had remained sealed, and no one had gone beneath it. The official theory from law enforcement remained consistent. On the day of the Easter egg hunt, Lily had likely noticed something out of place. A loose board, a gap in the earth, a strange smell. Children are naturally curious, and for a child barely 3 feet tall, the cellar entrance would have been nearly eye level. She may have tugged it open herself. The ladder inside was old and broken. If she stepped down even 1 rung, it could have collapsed, pulling the hatch closed behind her. Or she may have simply slipped. No one would have heard her. The soil and stone muffled sound. And by the time her name was called, the opportunity to save her had passed. It wasn't anyone's fault, but it didn't feel that way. Neighbors who had once been quick to speculate now sat quietly behind drawn curtains. Some left flowers at the edge of the fence. Others didn't know what to say. One former city employee, now retired, came forward with a faded photocopy of the 1976 demolition list. Lily's address was marked, but with an asterisk. The structure was pending fill. The check mark to confirm completion was blank. It had been assumed handled. That assumption had echoed across 40 years, enough time for a cellar to become a grave. The Kesslers didn't speak publicly. Their silence became part of the investigation's final chapter. The father, once so outspoken, now avoided reporters entirely. The mother moved in with a cousin 2 towns over. The grandmother, whose backyard had held the secret for all those years, was hospitalized briefly after the discovery, citing shock and exhaustion. None of them blamed each other, not directly, but nothing was ever quite the same again. The garden was dismantled, the trellis torn down, the cellar filled in and sealed permanently with concrete and stone. But before that, the space was left open for a day, just long enough for the family to walk its edge, just long enough for them to see what had been missed. What haunted investigators most wasn't the failure of procedure or technology. It was the human nature of forgetting, of assuming something sealed is no longer there, of walking the same ground every day and never thinking to look down. One detective later said it best, "Sometimes it's not that the answers are buried too deep. It's that we forget where we buried the questions." And in this case, the question had been underfoot the entire time. Quiet, waiting, and sealed behind a fence meant to keep children safe. The cellar was emptied, catalogued, and sealed. But before the final structural fill began, forensic examiners conducted one last survey of the interior walls. They worked inch by inch, using angled lights and fingerprint powder to trace the last touches of air that had moved in that space. Near the inner side of the wooden hatch, just above the rusted metal latch that hadn't worked in decades, they found it. A single handprint, small, faint, and smudged with age. It was pressed flat against the wood, angled upward, not outward, palm open, fingers curled slightly, not reaching forward, reaching up. A child's hand, her size, her height, her desperation. The lab couldn't lift usable ridge detail from the print, but the context was enough. She hadn't died instantly. She had tried. Maybe called out, maybe cried quietly. She had stood beneath that hatch, in the dark, pressing her hand against the only part of the ceiling that opened to air. If someone had been in the garden that day, and paused just for a second, if they'd walked closer, listened harder, maybe they would have heard her. But the trellis had vines, the hatch had roots, and the sounds of spring above had drowned out whatever had been lost below. The autopsy confirmed what the scene implied. There was no trauma to her bones, no signs of struggle or restraint. But her lungs had collapsed inward. There were early signs of carbon dioxide toxicity. She had likely died from slow oxygen deprivation, hours, not minutes, possibly even longer. Investigators sat with that timeline in silence. If she'd lived into the night, into the next morning, it meant the entire first search, the helicopters, the dogs, the shouting, had all happened while she was still under their feet, still alive, and no one knew. The Kessler family was briefed privately. The mother didn't speak. The father left the room halfway through. The grandmother asked just one question. Why hadn't they found her sooner? The answer was both honest and unbearable. Because they hadn't thought to look there. Because the ground didn't open when they asked it to. Because whoever built that hatch sealed it too well. But the discovery of the handprint and the confirmation of Lily's cause of death also shifted the focus of the letters. Until now, they'd been treated as eerie, possibly cruel, possibly informed. But with this new evidence, the tone of the messages, their precision, their timing, felt less like guesswork and more like guilt. You planted too deep. She never left the fence. Spring won't hide her forever. These weren't just poetic, they were facts. And then there was the sentence about blueberries, the line only someone who had been with Lily could have known. The writer wasn't speculating. The writer had known. The writer had waited. The FBI re-examined the envelopes again, this time with more advanced trace detection. They found nothing new. The DNA on the stamps and seals didn't match anyone in CODIS. There were no local matches. The ink was traced to a common brand of toner. The paper, off the shelf. Whoever had sent them knew how to leave nothing behind. David Kessler, the uncle, was asked to provide another DNA sample for exclusion. He agreed. The match was negative. He had not licked the envelopes. He had not written the notes. For the first time in years, he was removed from the suspect list. But that left a deeper problem. If not him, then who? Who had known Lily had fallen in? Who had watched and said nothing and waited 7 years to tell the family where she was? Someone nearby. Someone who had access or insight or guilt. Someone who may have been on that property during or after the disappearance. The investigation, already exhausted, found no new suspects. Neighbors were re-interviewed. Construction workers from prior decades were tracked down. Nothing held. The letters stopped after the final one. No confession, no name. For the Kesslers, the handprint was both a beginning and an end. It proved she had fought, that she had tried, that she had lived longer than they thought. But it also confirmed the worst fear, that someone had known she was there and chosen silence. Whether out of fear, shame, or something darker, that choice meant everything. That print on the underside of the hatch wasn't just a mark of presence. It was a plea. A record of the moment before hope ran out, a final reach that no one saw. And so the case, once considered open again, began to close. Lily had been found. Her cause of death had been determined, her burial site explained, but the person who watched her fall into silence and then waited to lead everyone back was still out there. Not as a name, not as a face, just as a shadow in a series of envelopes, a witness without a voice, a truth that waited until the guilt could be buried no longer. The reburial was held at sunrise on April 6th, 2025. No cameras, no reporters, just a handful of chairs beneath a pale sky and a headstone that carried her full name for the first time in 7 years. Lily Marie Kessler, born April 3rd, 2013. Died April 8th, 2018. The service lasted 11 minutes. Her mother spoke only once, thanking those who came. Her father placed the same purple plastic egg from the excavation beside the marker, sealed again, but now empty. No one read from scripture. No one spoke in platitudes. They didn't have to. The weight of the truth, once buried in soil and silence, was now heavier than words could carry. After the investigation was formally closed, a forensic botanist attached to the team filed a supplemental report. It hadn't made news headlines, but inside the case files, it answered a question that had haunted the earliest days of the search: why the dogs missed her, why the scent had failed. When the soil cores were analyzed, they found dense interlacing roots from the trellis had grown downward over decades, some wrapping tightly around the wooden slats of the cellar hatch. The roots hadn't just obstructed the space visually, they had created a living barrier, reducing the ability for decomposition gases to rise through the ground in detectable concentrations. It was a biological seal, natural and unnoticed, until it was too late. Lily hadn't just been hidden by dirt and concrete, she had been covered by growth, a garden that flourished while she faded beneath it. Experts called it a perfect storm: depth, soil type, weather, and roots. Dogs don't fail often, but when they do, it's almost always because the body is physically insulated. The mulch, the compacted earth, and especially the age of the wooden hatch all contributed. When the sinkhole was discovered years prior, its collapse had masked the scent further, pushing air pockets away from the original source. The spot the dogs had first alerted to was correct. It just wasn't precise enough. Every tool used had missed her by inches. Every eye had looked past it. Every hand had turned over the wrong patch of dirt. The morning of the reburial, just hours after the family returned home, the final letter arrived. Same envelope, same postmark. Verona, Idaho. Inside, a single sentence typed in the same block font as before. No date, no name, no sign-off. You found the seed you buried. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet. Like the others, it implied knowledge beyond what had ever been made public. And it forced one final question to the front. Had the writer watched it happen? Had they seen Lily fall in? Had they heard the search from behind a window and said nothing? Had they returned years later and left a note to ease their own guilt? Or had they been there all along? The FBI reopened the letter case file one last time. Analysts combed local post office logs, Cameras at sorting facilities were reviewed, though most footage had long been overwritten. The stamp was standard. The envelope, identical to the others. The printer, still untraceable. The forensic linguist noted consistency in tone and cadence. Whoever wrote the letters had remained emotionally neutral, never celebratory, never angry. The wording never mocked the family, never made demands. But the knowledge inside the letters made one thing clear. They were not written by a stranger guessing from news coverage. They came from someone who had been close, too close. Speculation online exploded after the letter leaked to a small true crime blog weeks later. Some believed it was the original contractor, now deceased, leaving a delayed confession scheduled by someone else. Others thought it was a neighbor, long overlooked, possibly a groundskeeper or extended relative. One theory suggested the writer had been a child themselves at the time, someone who saw Lily go in but didn't understand what they were witnessing. As the years passed, that memory might have evolved into guilt too heavy to name, but no suspect ever matched. No one was arrested. The truth, whatever it was, stayed sealed with the soil. The house was eventually sold, the garden removed, the trellis demolished, the yard leveled and paved over by new owners unaware of its history. But the case remained one of the most haunting in Idaho's investigative history, not for its violence, but for its silence. A child disappeared in daylight within feet of her family and was hidden by time, biology, and human oversight. No monsters, no abduction, just a cellar door no one remembered and a voice no one heard. What grew over her in those years wasn't just vines or grass. It was the idea that grief must always be explained, that missing children must always have villains. But sometimes the ground itself swallows the answer. And even when it's finally found, the question of who knew and who watched never really goes away.